Reviewing again Frank Tannenbaum's Slave and Citizen, the Negro in the Americas. In this particular book, the purpose was to illustrate the fact that slavery seemed very different between the two continents of Latin America and the United States, or the Caribbean and South America and the North American continent, specifically in the areas of violence and agency. The African slaves, though came through the Middle Passage, were brought over here, and where they were dropped off received two very different systems of slavery. Tannenbaum is actually presenting that religious dogma had quite a bit to do with the outcome. How it's written here is the author has determined that the definition of a man as a moral being proved to be the most important influence both in the treatment of the slave and the final abolition of slavery. So not only was this a difference, that the religious difference, the Catholic influence in South America as opposed to the Protestant influence in North America, not only did it affect the experience of a slave, but it functioned in making the abolition of slavery easier to come about, in his opinion, in South America, and it being harder to come about in North America. This book was published in 1947, and the thesis or argument is the difference between the slavery systems were rooted in theology. Used an example of slavery in Brazil compared to that of South America, or to the American South. In Brazil, the Negro had access to culture and a role in social life unknown to the Negro in the United States. This was a very unique work as to where it, one, recognized the difference in slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and two, gave a root, a theologic root, saying that the basis of old Roman law that made its way into Catholicism being the core, in that you could not remove the soul from the person, which was why the person had the ability to receive manumissions easier, where they were able to earn their freedom or purchase their freedom under Catholic dominion, as opposed to the Protestant North, as to where the people in North America lost not only their agency, but any agency coming from them, their children. How slavery initially was, if you were enslaved, that didn't pass on. There was a negotiated debt or an imposed debt, but that debt was not inherited. In North American slavery, it was in fact inherited. So that is the main point we're talking about. The Atlantic slave trade, but the different dynamics in how it was affected as it got to the Western Hemisphere. Now, Tannenbaum uses religious documentation, manumission documents, court records, contracts, international communication in this global transatlantic comparative transnational history, primarily of the United States and South America and Caribbean. Um, Again, the thesis is centered around the presence or absence of Justinian law. Justinian law is the Roman law that is at the core of Catholicism. Now, this research compares the story of slavery in the Western Hemisphere through the prism of religious doctrine and dogma. Tannenbaum identified the most obvious differences in the system of slavery in the northern and southern hemisphere of the Western Hemisphere, being that of a much less violent culture in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Now, that's not the southern part of the United States or the southern part of North America. We're specifically talking about South America and Caribbean and the North American continent. So remember, you have your Spanish colonies in South America and Caribbean. You have your English Protestant colonies in the north. So that's the difference what we're talking about. Portuguese, Spain, France, Southern Hemisphere. English, 13 colonies, Northern Hemisphere. Violence, Northern Hemisphere. And not only the difference, but he is proposing that slavery was easier to abolish because of this dynamic. Now, problem is, all manumissions were not less violent, or freedom was not sought less violent in the Southern Hemisphere, obviously, biggest one being the Haitian Revolution. But to say that manumissions were easier in the South, would thereby imply that they were harder in the North. Well, two things kind of go along with that. That's the implication that slavery did end or ever ended in North America, which in a closer reading of the 13th Amendment, it is decisive that slavery did not end in North America. So you have to watch some of the given or foundational statements of the authors that may or may not be accurate. There's some limitations to this work, obviously. Though he admitted that there are limitations to the access in the Southern Hemisphere, this comparison was striking when it compared to the complete absence of such agency of the Negro in North America. Slave and Citizen continued to illustrate how slaves in the Southern Hemisphere and Latin America were able to earn wages due to skill or opportunity. So that's something that's very important. A lot of times it's not pointed out in traditional education in America that in the South America systems of slavery, if you had a unique skill, you could actually earn wages on quote unquote your time. Now, the fact that they had a degree of agency as to where they could have a degree of time was unique to the circumstances in North America, because they had no time, because nothing was theirs. They were owned by somebody. But even more, the church allowed or required the person to have time to perform rituals, to perform traditions, and to participate, to attend church. So there was a degree of agency that came by way of the natural setup of Christianity. So there was a degree of autonomy based on talent and based on religious practice that was not necessarily granted in North America. Tannenbaum describes a couple of things. He continued to illustrate how slaves in the Southern Hemisphere were able to earn wages out of skill and opportunity. With these wages, slaves were able to purchase their freedom, in many cases the freedom of their family. He described this as an acceptance unthinkable to the American scene, obviously, meaning the United States or the 13 colonies. He asserts in Latin America, slavery and freedom were socially and morally speaking very close together. Again, slavery and freedom were socially and morally very close together. Freedom from slavery in the southern portion of the Western Hemisphere, the author persists, was kinder, and as its status was not final as to where it was final in North America. This work is relevant today because it brings about a unique perspective of how you can draw history in a very narrow way and pull facts and information historically valuable by looking at very original perspectives. This is a religious comparative history between Catholics and Protestants and their effect on slavery. So it's not touching right or wrong, it's touching dogma. So that in and of itself keeps this book very relevant. This is a second class in graduate school I've had this particular book. So if it's not necessarily worth reading, it's definitely worth being aware of.